This is a configuration manager prerequisite tool, and this is version 3.0.2. That's what we have there. The guy that wrote it, this dude right here, he actually wrote this section in the book on it. So Santos got a hold of the guy and said, hey, I want to talk about your free third-party prerequisite checker, and would you be willing to write a couple sections that talks about how to install it? And the guy said, sure. And so in your book, this guy wrote a bunch of stuff that talks about it. Now in your book, it's kind of old. But this is where you download it. But what I want to show you is what I've done. I've gone onto my server, and I went and I downloaded all of the prerequisites, all of the software, all of the ISOs, and what I did is I stuck it on a file share, but then I copied it down here and I call it the System Center stuff. And inside the System Center stuff, you'll notice that I have the prerequisite tool. This prerequisite tool comes in a zip file format, so that's a zip file. And all you have to do is extract it, and that's what I've done right here. And then you can fire off this prerequisite checker tool, and it will go in and it will see if we have all of our prerequisites. Now, there's other things that we have as a requirement, and I have those already downloaded as well. So, for example, I have SQL Server. Now, I have both Enterprise and Standard of Windows Server 2016. The nice thing about doing this on Windows Server 2016, you don't have to do any cumulative updates or anything like that. If you're doing it on 2017, you have to have at least cumulative update 3. And if you're doing it in an earlier version like SQL Server 2014, well, they have their own requirements. We also need to have this is a little TechNet update for this particular SQL Server. And if you actually know, this is for 2017. This was a hot fix that's required, but we don't require it. This is our SMS setup that we have. We also have this Visual C++ redistributable. So I've just downloaded all this stuff. Also, as part of this, you're going to install the ADK. That is your automated deployment toolkit. I have that down as well. But the cool part about it is that instead of having to go through and do all this stuff manually, they have this prerequisite checker and this prerequisite component that'll install it for me. So let me go ahead and show you that. So I'm going to go in here. Now, I've already installed SQL Server on here, and I've already installed like the C++ redistributable, stuff like that. But let's see what this tool does. Now, they talk about the documentation over on page 109. When I fire this off, it's going to do a validation check. It's going to see, hey, do we have a reboot that is pending here? It's also going to find out if we're running the right operating system. It's going to make sure that we have the right version of PowerShell, because this is all done with PowerShell scripts. And then the last thing it's going to do is it's going to make sure that we are running this as administrator. And I don't think I ran this as administrator. So just to be sure, I'm going to right-click on it, and I'm going to run this as administrator. I think I did. I think I may have set the properties to run as administrator. Otherwise, I wouldn't have got that user account control window that you may or may not have been able to see. So in order for this to run, what I need to do is I need to be running this on Windows Server 2012 or 2012 R2 or 2016. Now, if I'm going to be running this on Windows Server 2016, that means I'm installing System Center version 1710, which is the one that I'm running. The book is written on 1602, I believe, so it is an older version. So it's not going to quite line up with this. But they go through and they say you download it, you extract it, make sure that you elevate it. They talk about that on page 110. Some of these, I will just tell it where the file is. Other places, I'll actually have to run the file. There's going to be a whole bunch of tabs, and the tabs can be confusing. Also, the tabs don't match what's in the book, because this talks about an earlier version. This is version 142 in the book, and we are over on version 302, so it's a little bit different. All right, so let me get my head out of the way, and we will show you what each of these are. Now, the first thing that we have is we have the site selection. It's asking us what type of site we're trying to do, primary, central admin, or secondary site. And if we're doing a primary, it'll say if we had a failed installation, do we want to try to install it, but maybe with a different source? And it'll go in and it'll show me that. We're not doing that yet. If I'm doing central admin sites, looks exactly the same. If we're doing secondary sites, it looks exactly the same. They all need SQL, and we will go through and we'll talk about it a little bit later. Now, this is the prerequisites. It's not actually going to install System Center. It is designed just to get the stuff necessary to allow us to pass the prerequisite check so that when we try to install System Center, it'll actually install, which is kind of nice. Now, this is the site type. See, the weird thing about this app is there's tabs here and there's tabs over there, and the tabs are not necessarily related to each other. They're just not necessarily related to each other. So here is our site selections where we can pick the type of site that we're trying to validate for. Then we have prerequisite files. These are files that the prerequisite tool will use to install prerequisites, but you have to tell it where the files are. So what we want is the SMS setup binary x64, and I want the setup dl.exe. So I hit browse, and then I have this on this little DVD here. So we go SMS setup, we'll go into binary, we'll go into 64, and the name of the file is setupdl.exe. So we will say setupdl.exe. And did we find it? Setupdl right there, setupdl.exe. So I'll say OK. Then it also says when you do the setup, what System Center is going to do is it's going to contact Microsoft and it's going to download a whole bunch of updated files. And what this second section here does is it says, where would you like to put them? So we will tell them where we're going to put them. And what I like to do is I just put it with my other SMS stuff. So I know it's all in the same place. In fact, I've already downloaded it. But what the heck? So we have SCCM setup downloads. That's what we want. And we'll say OK. And what this is going to download, it says it's not empty because we already have stuff in there. But what it's going to download is a bunch of the updates that they have. And there's lots and lots of updates. So it'll download it, or if you've already downloaded it, like I have it on a central spot, like on this file server, when I do the prerequisite checks, I can point them at this location. This is where this is. And then it'll pull it down from that as opposed to going up to Microsoft. So having them downloaded will save you bandwidth because you're not downloading it on every site server. And you can have it centrally located, so then if I need to make another site, I already have all the files. I don't have to go somewhere else to be able to pull them down. So pretty handy there. Now also remember that you don't necessarily have to do every single tab. So in this one, this is designed to download the pieces. I already have the pieces downloaded, so I don't need to run that. And what I would do is once I have this filled out, I would say start, and it will run this particular program. And since I haven't told it, or I will need to tell it where to put it, it'll contact Microsoft and download them. That's the whole purpose of this particular screen, is to just download the prerequisites. That's all that it is. That's all that it does. Then over here we have preferences. And what preferences does is that System Center Configuration Manager has had a little bit of a bad reputation. And what it'll do is if you have a server that you say, I want you to be a site server, what System Center will do is it'll go in and look at the hard drive, and whichever one is the biggest hard drive, that's where it tries to install all the stuff. And the way to keep it from doing that is you would go into the root of that drive, and you would create a file called no SMS on drive right here, this file right here. So what this tab does is if I have multiple drives, on this machine I only have the one, what I can do is I can flag the drive, hit create, and it will make that file on the root of that drive that says, hey, System Center Configuration Manager, don't put your stuff on this drive. So that's just to keep it from going all over the place. And if you don't do this, it will go back to its old behavior and just find the one, well, there's a variation on it, but it'll try and find the one that has the most space. So that's what this prerequisite is. And that is pretty much all the tabs on the site thing. That's what we have right there. Then if we go into roles, this will download the prerequisites for a particular role. So if I have a server, I want it to be a site server, and I want it to be a management point, or I want it to be a software proxy point, or I want it to do this or do that. And as you can see, there are lots and lots and lots and lots of different roles. What this will do is it will download whatever the prerequisites are for that particular role. And if you already have the prerequisites installed, it won't download them and install them again. So, it's intelligent as far as that goes. But it does allow you to go in and pick just what you need for each of these particular jobs. And a lot of times what folks will do is they will use a low-level user account for all their System Center needs, and that's kind of the best practice. Then this user account can be assigned the permissions, and that's the only thing that it can do, and it keeps it nice and protected. Or what I can do is I can use the local account, the local server account, but I need to make sure that that local account has the appropriate permissions. And if I have that in place, one of the things that this tool will let me do is I can go in and I can say, yeah, we're going to go ahead and use credentials for either for the remote system. So I can either do local configuration, or I can do remote configuration, and I can put in alternate credentials if that's what I need to do. And that's that tab. Now, the order that we have in the book versus the order that we have that we're talking about it isn't necessarily exactly the same. I'm trying to get fairly close to it, but just remember that the book is a little bit out of date. So you can install management points is over on page 112, distribution points, application catalog prerequisites, enrollment points, enrollment proxies, and state migration points. Now, you can't do all of the roles. And that's because some of these are going to require things like a feature installation, something like that. Now, the next one that we have is the directory. And what this is if I go in here, it's going to be talking about the schema to begin with. And the schema is the database definition file. So in Active Directory, which is a database, I have objects in this database. For example, I have user accounts. This user account has different fields associated with that record. They will have first name, last name, middle initial, SID, whatever that we have on there. Those little fields are what are called the schema of that record. Well, Active Directory by default doesn't know anything about System Center. And so what you have to do is you have to add those additional fields to the variety of objects in Active Directory. That's called extending the schema. The good news is you only have to extend it once. So if you've already extended it back when you first installed System Center 2007 or whatever, then you probably don't need to extend it again. But if you do decide to extend it, you're not going to hurt anything. Realize that in order to extend the schema, the user account that's doing this has to be a member of the schema admins group. And by default, the only member of the schema admins group is that first administrator in the first domain in your entire forest. So a lot of times what you'll have to do is get your Active Directory folks to extend the schema, or you can, if you have the appropriate permissions, you could do it here as well. So what you do is you can identify the schema master. The schema master is the first domain controller that's installed in the forest. It's usually the first domain controller, but you can move that somewhere else. And when you extend the schema, you do it against the schema master. That is the only machine in my entire forest that has a read-write copy of the schema. All my other domain controllers has a read-only copy, but this one alone has the only read-write copy. The good news is I can find out who the schema master is by querying Active Directory. But on this one, I can also do a detect, and what it'll do is it'll query Active Directory and it'll find out who the schema master is. Or if I like, I can hit browse, and then I can tell it where the schema master is. So either way. Then we need to tell it where this particular executable is. This is our baseline executable. This is the one that actually extends the schema. By default, it's in 64, and it's called extad schedule. So I'm going to hit browse, and we'll just browse to my installation media. So we'll go into there. Oops, that's my SQL Server install. Nope, that was the right one. System Center. So we go into SMS Setup. We go into Binary. We go into 64, and what we're looking for is EXTA schedule, and it's an executable. That's what we want. And now it is populated. And so then I would hit the button here called extend, and it would extend it. Now again, you do have to be an enterprise admin, or I'm sorry, you need to be a Schema admin. Enterprise admin doesn't have enough. You have to be a Schema admin to be able to extend it. So if you need to use alternate credentials, you can select it and then put in the alternate credentials. So that extends the schema for us. Also, if you want to put in a software update point, you would need to install WSUS. When you install WSUS, this is over on the bottom of page 112, top of page 113, you can decide do you want to use a SQL database or do you want to use a Windows internal database. You can use either one. If you use Windows internal database, it is going to be installed locally, and it'll be able to work. Now, with SQL, you need to put in the host name of a Windows-based server running SQL. You'd also need to put in an instance name. If I want it to create the database separately on the default instance, I just leave that name blank, and then it'll install WSUS. There is some configuration that we need to do after the fact. It'll say, hey, you need to update it. They recommend that if you are using WSUS, you don't store the content on your system or your boot volume. Store it on a different drive. And you want it to, and what's going to happen is with WSUS, it's going to integrate with System Center, so you're going to manage it with System Center. And if you don't want to install WSUS locally, you have a remote WSUS server. On your local site server, you have to have the WSUS tools. So you'd have to install those. But once you have them installed, then you'll be able to talk to that remote WSUS server. All right, so the next thing that we have to do is we have to install the automated deployment kit. So we'll go into ADK, and we will pick our particular version that we want. So I can just go ahead and say load, and it will go in. Oh, I don't have connectivity. But what I can do is I can tell it what version that I want, and we will download it, and then I can go ahead and tell it, yeah, I want to pull it down. But this machine right now doesn't have internet connectivity. So you just download it. And what I've done is I've downloaded it into the stuff, and I can install it there as opposed to installing it here. Remember, none of this is System Center. This isn't System Center. This is a third-party utility that Santos found, and he had his author write up about it, but it is a really nice utility. So you can do all this stuff manually. This just makes it a little bit easier. So you tell it where it is. Then, once we have that, we also have, well, we have the container. Did I miss this? Directory is good. ADK, if I do it offline, I can tell you where I've already downloaded it. I can do that, so let me do that. So that is in my computer, and on my, it's not in the libraries. I don't know where I'm thinking. It's on my computer. So we'll say my computer, this PC. Here we go. There we go. And then we'll go into the C drive, into my System Center stuff. And I have it right here. I have it right there in the folder. And so I would click install, and it would install the ADK, because that's where I have it. And a lot of times you can do stuff online or offline. For example, ADK I can do online, offline. Some other things I can do online, offline. You can pick and choose. All right, SQL Server. SQL Server is primarily for us to limit the amount of memory. SQL, by default, will try and eat every last drop of RAM that we have on our system. And we want to control that. So what I do is I put, in a minimum, you have to have 8 gigs of RAM for the SQL Server. So I have 8 gigs of RAM as a starting value and as the ending value. And then I just hit configure, and it'll go in and bring it in there. But again, I don't have all my connectivity in place. So 8 gig will allow us to do that. We also have our collation. Collation, very, very important that you have the appropriate collation. It is the default collation that they have in here. So as long as you don't change it, you'll be fine. We'll see the collation. We have a slide on it a little bit later. We'll talk about it. On my databases, I can put in the name of the site code if I would like. A lot of folks will like to use airport codes. I don't use that anymore because you can't change it, and so I just use numbers like 001. On my central admin site, since I'm only allowed one of those, I'll call that CAS. That'll be my site name. And I'll just go 001, 002, 003, so on and so on and so on. And that makes it a little bit easier for me. I can also specify how many cores that we can use. I can also talk about the size of the database that we're going to do. I can also go in and set the initial size. And what this is doing is it's pre-creating my System Center database. I don't have to do that, but this will speed things up because now I already have a database that is already set up. I just need to make sure that I have the right site code on it and the number of CPUs and all of that. Then we have SSRS. This will tell me the maximum file size for the reporting service would be 20 meg, or 20 gig, I mean, and also the database maximum size is going to be 20 gig. And that will go in and it'll configure those settings for us for that. WSUS, you specify the type of database. It could either be SQL or internal, and then you say install, and it'll go in and it'll install WSUS on your particular machine. Then you have the post install. This is where, again, you will tell it the type of database. You put in the fully qualified domain name and the instance name. You tell it where you want it to store the data. You hit configure, and it goes out and configures your WSUS database for you, which is actually pretty powerful. Makes it very easy for us to bring that in. Let's see, we've got that. If we go into settings here, we have the credentials. This is for remote access. So when I'm trying to do something on another application, maybe it's a remote site server. If I don't have a user account identified, what will happen is it'll try and use the computer account of my System Center Management Server site server. And so I would need to make sure that it is a member of the local administrator group on all the machines, or I can use a user account. And if I use a user account, I can make it a member of the administrators group, and then it will use the user accounts as opposed to using the default computer account that we have on there.